This is Open Door with Vince Robinson. In-depth conversations with people who are making a difference in the lives of others here and around the world. Culture is at the heart of who you are. Know your culture, find yourself on Open Door with Vince Robinson.
Grand dawning, great rising, Cleveland, Ohio, and the rest of the planet. Welcome to another edition of Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guest is not a Clevelander. Many of the folks that I have on the program are from the Cleveland area, but I do interview folks from other parts of the world. And today I'm privileged to have on the air with me someone from Chillicothe, Ohio, which is where my father grew up and where my mother currently lives. So I'm really happy and pleased to bring to you someone that is a great friend of the family. They have history. Many of you may or may not know that my father was the president of the NAACP in Ross County for 19 years. My sister is now serving in that capacity. And both of them have been, seriously entwined with my guest. She is Beverly J. Gray. She was born in Ross County and received her early and high school education in Paint Valley schools. She's a graduate of Ohio University, majoring in elementary education with a minor in history. She studied at Kent State University, my alma mater, the Ohio State University, and the College of Mount St. Joseph in Cincinnati and Ashland College. She holds certificates in elementary education, vocational education, and reading development. She's also been an adjunct professor of education for Ohio University, working in the correctional institutions of Ohio. She taught elementary classes at Paint Valley schools, and she's been an elementary, middle school, and high school teacher in the Chillicothe City School District. She was a school-to-work coordinator for Chillicothe schools from 1996 to 98. She's a primary teacher and tutor to the Even Start Family Literacy Program, spent 4 years as an educational specialist at Adena Mansion and Gardens. She's currently a tutor of students diagnosed with dyslexia at the David Ater Clinic and is coordinator of the David Nickens Heritage Center. So that's quite a bit to squeeze into the time that you've been in existence on the planet. I'm not going to tell your age. Mom said you may not appreciate that. But just suffice it to say that she's been around for a while. Beverly, welcome to Open Door with Vince Robinson.
Thank you, Vincent.
So the last accomplishment that is on your resume is the coordinator of the David Nickens Heritage Center. And I know that that has a special place in your heart and in your mind right now. So I want to let you talk about what's going on there. But I also want to talk to you about this extensive history that you have that is connected to history, actually. And it's not just exclusively African-American history. You know, I was reading through what you sent me, and I see that you have an affinity to Monticello and Thomas Jefferson. I think there was something in there about the Irish as well. So we'll talk about those things as well. But let's talk about your connection with the David Nickens Heritage Center.
Okay, well, the David Nickens Heritage Center is a newish museum that is actually situated adjacent to the First Baptist Church in Chillicothe, Ohio. Now, the First Baptist Church was established in 1824 by one David Nickens, who at that time was an Underground Railroad operator and an abolitionist in that he was a great orator and not only was active in the movement but also was a part of the rhetoric of the time. And so when it was decided that we would use the house that's adjacent to First Baptist as a museum, we thought the perfect person to name it after would be David Nickens, given his place in Chillicothe history and Ohio history as well as the national scene.
Oh, that's amazing. You know, just recently I participated in a couple of staged readings that honored John Malvin, who was also an abolitionist. He was active in Cincinnati for a short season, and then he relocated to Cleveland, Ohio, where there is a street that's named for him. And it's adjacent to something called the Cozad Bates House, which is believed to have possibly been, but hasn't been documented, as a station on the Underground Railroad. What do you know of John Malvin, if you know?
Well, I'm not. I'm not someone that has a lot of expertise about him. I know of his work, the fact that he was involved as in the whole abolitionist movement. That also David Nickens was involved. You mentioned, I believe you mentioned Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be a place where a lot of this fomented, where the people that went on to become leaders in the abolitionist movement in the state of Ohio seem to have come together in Cincinnati. David Nickens was one of those also, as was a number of other people that if I would mention, you would probably recognize them as being Underground Railroad operators and being involved in the movement at some way or other.
Yes. Well, it's really beautiful that you or whomever chose to honor him by naming the museum for him. And I think that goes a long way towards raising cultural awareness and just historical awareness as well, because many of our heroes in the history of this country go unnoticed because they've been left out of the history books. And I'm sure you're well aware of movements right now to kind of erase history and kind of, I'll just use the term whitewash it for lack of a better term. But in the process, a lot of what happened with us gets lost. So kudos to you for keeping the spirit of that movement alive and bringing this information to the public. We spoke briefly a day ago or so, and I wanted to talk to you about what it was like for you growing up in Chillicothe and perhaps having a thirst for knowledge of history. Can you talk about what it was like for you growing up in Chillicothe?
Okay. Actually, I didn't grow up in the town of Chillicothe. I grew up about 15 miles south of Chillicothe in a rural area. All of my school experience was in rural schools. My church experience was also in a rural church, which, by the way, was the same age as First Baptist Church, being established in 1824. For some reason or other, I've always loved the mystery, and I've always been very interested in family history in particular, because in my own family, very early I learned my own family history, so that was always something that interested me. But the thing that kind of piqued my interest was in the church that I grew up in, which was the Eden Baptist Church on the borders of Ross and Pike counties, established 1824, had just that sign over the door of the church. It said, established 1824. And I noticed, because my first school with history had to be in the fifth grade. You didn't get that till fifth grade here, and so I was just sucking up all this history that I was learning about in school. But the one thing I noticed was there wasn't anything in it about my people. There was only one picture, and it was one of those what they call sepia pictures, and it was a drawing, actually, of slaves picking cotton. Well, when I used to go into church on Sundays and other days, and I'd see this sign over the door of 1824, I thought, well, I can do the math, and that doesn't make sense. How could people of color build a church in 1824 if we were just picking cotton? There must be something here I don't know. And for that reason, that grew up in me from a young child, I suppose 8 or 9 years old, when I realized there was some incongruency in what I was learning at school, or I should say what I wasn't learning at school, and what I realized was the reality based on the situation that I was actually living.
Okay. Could you talk about your family? What have you learned about your family historically that might be of interest?
Well, I have actually two families, as everybody does. I have a Williams Cousins family, which is my paternal side, and then I have a Davis side, which is my maternal side. And so we had I had a grandmother, like a lot of people did. And my grandmother used to talk incessantly about the old days. And I was so fascinated by the stories that she would tell. that I always listened. And sometimes I think because I listened, Grandma sort of supplanted me as being one of those people back in the past, because different times she would talk about Uncle John or somebody, and she'd say, well, you know, and I'd say, no, Grandma, I don't know. And she would look at me and she'd say, well, Bev, I guess you don't, do you? And so, but I would listen to those stories, and so I got some sense of how it was our people migrated, at least on the Davis side, migrated to Ohio, coming from Virginia in the 1850s, mid-1850s actually, which was kind of late, but they were a part of that great migration that took place between 1850 and 1860, just prior to the Civil War. And that there were, and I remember my mother, she was always very interested, and we were able to find pictures of, like my great-great-grandmother who had been a slave. And we were, actually it was a tintype, and we were able to find some things like that. So what that did is it began to put flesh on the bones of my ancestors on my mother's side. There was some some information passed down that we were descendants of a particular personage who is historical, but it's somebody that most people didn't want to be related to. And so I said to my mother when she told me the story, I said, well, you know, how come we're not hearing this? And she said, well, who wants to be related to blank and blank? And I said, well, I guess you're right about that. But I was able then, as research took place, able to find the actual plantation that my great-great-grandmother came from, or it was actually brought here by her former enslaver. And when I say brought here, I'm talking about brought to Ross County. And, of course, they had a family, and from that I descend, my mother, and then I descend. Now, they came from Central Virginia. On the other side of the fence, which is my father's, they came out of northern North Carolina in Granville and Person counties, and there was quite a bit of paper trail for them because they owned their own land and sold that land and migrated north in the migration of the 1850s and settled in Ross County, as did my Davis ancestors did. And so those two families came together, and of course married folk in the area. They all had large families. My Davis side, they had 13 children, and on my father's side, my paternal side, they had 12 children. So they were big families, which means they're going to be marrying in a lot of other different families, which kind of brings in a circular thing so that people in the area are interconnected. And so, well, as I said, my family was part of my family was a little late coming because they didn't come until the 1850s. But on one of the sides of the fences, on the cousin side, we were related to a family by the name of Barnett. Well, we call them Barnett, but in the country. But today they're known as Barnett. And they go back to a Underground Railroad operator by the name of James Barnett. And they settled out in the what we now call the PP community. He bought an enormous amount of land, so he was obviously a person of some wealth, and settled there. And his coming was about 1830, which meant that my family, one part of my family, has been in the area since late 1820s and early 1830s.
That's interesting. And I noticed that you chose not to name the ancestor who was involved in enslavement. I could only imagine that perhaps his first name started with Jefferson, but I'm just going out on a limb, and I'll leave that one alone. But
okay, did you say his first name?
Jefferson.
Started with Jefferson?
Yes.
Well, you're on the right track.
Okay, all right.
But it wasn't Thomas Jefferson, and people get that mixed up.
Right. Yeah.
So you're on the right track.
Okay. That's interesting. And, one connection that I would like to make is to who we were before the enslavement process happened. So I want to talk to you a little bit about perhaps having a connection to that prehistory, so to speak, when we return. You're listening to Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU, Burton Bell Car Community Radio. My guest is historian Beverly J. Gray, and we'll be right back after this.
Hi, this is Deborah Dahlman from the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, and you're listening to WOVU 95.9 FM.
Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson, having a very fascinating conversation with one of my heroes, actually. I'm just going to put it out there like that. She's very close to my mother, and my mother speaks glowingly of her. And in the past 14 minutes, I have found out why. She has an extensive knowledge of history of her family and others. And we were just talking about the fact that there was an enslaver in the history of her family, just as there was in the history of my family. I think my father's side of the family came from Virginia. My mother's side of the family came from Alabama. And, I just think about how many folks were in existence before it came to us. Like, for instance, I have two parents. My parents have 4 parents, and their parents have 8 parents, and so forth and so on. So when you keep going up that ladder, you find so many different possibilities. In light of the fact that you have shared that there was some, I guess, negative perception of the folks that may have been part of your family, and you've also done research on Thomas Jefferson and Monticello, I'm just curious, from your perspective, how do you reconcile the fact that there are folks in the family history that may not be so favorable when looked upon, and then when these families find out about each other and acknowledge the fact that they coexist, how do you cross that bridge between the animosity that exists because of enslavement and the fact that time goes on and people evolve and so forth and so on? What are your thoughts about that?
That's a very interesting question, Mr. Robinson.
I get it from my dad, so blame him.
I know. Well, I tell you, probably the most notable case and public case of which you've talked about is the Thomas Jefferson story and everything that has evolved about that in the last 20 years. I was, I say blessed because it gave me an opportunity to learn more about about history and about the whole business. Chillicothe in Ross County is an absolutely hotbed of information when it comes to African American history and all of all of the things that went into that, and one of them being the Jefferson story, because several of the descendants of that came here, settled in Ross County, and 2 of them went to the church I mentioned, Eden Baptist Church, and out in the country. And so there are all kinds of stories, and there's all kinds of records that talk about these people after they migrated to Ohio. Now, as you know, for a long time, the whole idea of any liaisons between Sally Hemings, a slave, and Thomas Jefferson, the president, was haughtily denied by everybody. Every historian that found everything always decided that it wasn't true, and they always figured out a way to negate it. And so about 20 years ago, one of the historians, the Shannon historian of Monticello, got the idea that driven by an African-American advisory board at the time, what happened to those enslaved individuals after they left Monticello? After they either were sold off or were driven off or whatever from Monticello, what happened to them and where did they go? Monticello was given a sizable grant from the Ford Foundation, and they decided they wanted to do a gathering of as many of the descendants that they could find. Well, because so many of them migrated to Ohio, and because I had, over the years, because I'm nosy and curious, had interviewed maybe 40 or 50 of the descendants, I was contacted about maybe helping out of getting a gathering together or whatever, which we did. And the first one was in, I think, 1993, and we gathered here. We had about 40 or 50 folks who claimed a descendancy from former enslaved individuals of Monticello. It was an amazing coming together. And from that, the Getting Word project that now exists at Monticello, and this is something that you can Google and get information about, began to evolve. And we started to interview people. I was the Ohio consultant, as I was called. There were 2 people from Monticello that were hired to just do this work. And so after 30 years of interviewing and people meeting people and this group meeting that group of people, what I think I've learned is that there has to be a modicum of healing. There's a lot of hurt on both sides. Having met a number of the individuals who were descendants of the enslavers, they have an issue. A lot of it is guilt. And a lot of them feel that they're being blamed for something that they have actually had no real part in. And then there are the individuals that are the products of those that were enslaved. And there's all of those issues that were involved in slavery in their psyche. And so you're going to have these 2 groups of people that when they initially come together, there's going to be some animosity. There's going to be some anger coming from the formerly enslaved camp, and then there's going to be some defensiveness coming from the enslavers. And so I think what has to happen, and I think this is that actually Monticello has done a decent job of this, and that is by sponsoring and having things that allow healing to take place. And I think that, for instance, there's a burial ground there at Monticello that's recently been dedicated, and it was a slave burial ground. And that was a place. So it's becoming a place of memorializing the individuals that were enslaved at that place, which heretofore had not happened. There have been several gatherings where all of these families came together on the hill. The last one that I was able to attend was not this year, but last year. There were 400 descendants of formerly enslaved individuals that had been at Monticello or at one of Jefferson's holdings. It was really an amazing thing to see because you could see how the families branched out and how they developed differently, even though they had the same common history. I think I'm beginning to see, and this is I'm getting on close to 30 years, that the other thing that they did, Monticello recognized the story as being true based on the DNA and other evidence that's come forward. And so what they did is they provided an exhibit that acknowledges Sally Hemings as an individual who was the mother of these children who had been fathered by Thomas Jefferson. And I think the fact that the acknowledgement has happened, and it's happened on a public level, has been very helpful in the descendants of the former slaves, because it is now giving them the credibility that they were so long denied. When you talk to a lot of the folks that we did interview, one of the stories that always came out of their experience was that if they talked about their heritage, especially in school, schools used to have the show and tell thing all the time, and so one of the things that several of the individuals did is they would share their history. They had their family charts and they shared their history. And in many of the cases, the teachers told them to stop lying and to stop saying those things because it wasn't true. So it shut them down. Now, these are children they're talking to, too. These are 9, 10, 11-year-old kids, which, excuse me, which did not aid the situation. As a matter of fact, it caused a total shutdown of the story. We found out that from about 1920 to possibly 1940, families didn't talk about it any longer. It just the families stopped passing the information along because it had been so. One of the first ones we ever interviewed was a man by the name of William Cunningham, who lived here in Chillicothe. Mr. Cunningham was, I think, a man in about his possibly 70s at the time, but he had a very rich memory, and he knew what he had been told of his ancestry and how it went back to, in this case, it was Mary Hemings and not Sally, because that's a story that hasn't often been told, that he also fathered children with Sally's sister Mary. Mm. And so what happened there was, for so long, they had been told not to tell the story because it was a lie. And I remember Mr. Cunningham had a house that had a lot of the memorabilia, including pictures and music and all kinds of things. And he wasn't able to talk about it because, and when we sat in my living room and we interviewed him for the first time, he sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And he said it was to the other ladies that came, was to Cinder Stanton, who was the Shannon historian for Monticello, and Dr. Diane Salon Wright, who was the specialist in oral history. He said it was the first time in many years that anybody had listened to his history and believed it. And he said, I'm so grateful. And I think he found that he was a man that probably whose life was not too much longer, but he felt that before his life ended, that it was validated. And, of course, that's what I think, and that was a long way of getting around to answering your question, but I think those were the two things that happened as a result of programs like Getting Word, is that it has assisted in the healing of the two groups, which was necessary. It's not totally done yet, but it has assisted it. It has acknowledged the validity of the formerly enslaved, the ancestors of the formerly enslaved individuals, and stamped their story as being true. And these two things, then, I think, helps to bring some. I don't want to use the word closure, but that's close to what I'm thinking about, to what's happened there.
Well,
I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I learned when I was a student at Kent State University studying with Fela Sawandi, who was a Yoruba chief. He said sometimes the way that you understand a tree is you walk around it. So, giving that perspective really gives us a better ability to understand that the dynamics that were in play. Couple of things. One, I was just thinking of that phrase, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Very necessary. Yeah. The second thing, though, is that, you mentioned the fact that some of the ancestors of those who had enslaved us carried a certain level of guilt. But I think it shouldn't go unmentioned that those who, quote unquote, owned us received reparations. And not only did they receive reparations, but they also continued to enjoy the benefit of the labor that we provided. So even though they didn't have a direct involvement in enslavement, they still have a relationship to it that allows them to enjoy a certain quality of life based on what we did. And I think that's the thing that we really need to focus on right now, in light of the fact that we have a presidential election in progress, and somehow magically every 4 years this idea of reparations, rears its head. And then after the election is over, then people forget about the issue. And, we've looked at economic stimulus and we found ways to provide an economic benefit to the country because of what happened as a result of the pandemic. But then when it comes to our suffering that we continue to deal with epigenetically, as well as socially, culturally, physically, mentally, spiritually, all those other things, that trauma that we've experienced goes largely unaddressed. And, we have this idea that racism is a public health crisis right now. And perhaps there are some well-intentioned individuals who want to do something about it, but that remains to be seen. It's time for us to go to our next break, but when I come back, I want to talk to you about crossing that bridge. And as we get into that conversation, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This is Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU, Burton Bell Carr Community Radio. My guest is historian and educator Beverly J. Gray. We'll be back after this.
Hey guys, this is D. Lachey. I'm all about togetherness. Together we make the world go round. You're listening to WOVU 95.9 FM.
Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guest is Beverly J. Gray. She is a resident of Chillicothe, Ohio. She is connected with the David Nickens Heritage Center. It is a museum that pays tribute to an abolitionist who was active during the early part of the 1800s. And we've been talking about the dynamic that exists between the ancestors of enslavers and the ancestors of formerly enslaved. It's really ironic that we're having this conversation right now because in about a week I'm supposed to take part in the reading of a play that involves a young man who was in search of his ancestors with full knowledge of the fact that his ancestor was a former enslaver, and a woman who was related to this man who meet in a cemetery and discover each other. And it's called The Reunion. I have read the play. I made a few comments to the person who wrote the play, and I just, in my own way, I just kind of went down a road of expressing myself truthfully about the subject. She told me that she decided to make some changes in the play, and I'll find out what they are in the next couple of days. But it's all because of the fact that I did that stage reading about John Malvin and got an awareness of him. But the thing that I'm curious about is, when it comes to history, we tie our history many times to enslavers, but we never really get to who we were before we were enslaved. And we're kind of all over the board on this because there's a camp that says, well, we're not all the descendants of folks who were enslaved. We were already here before the enslavement process took place. We're actually indigenous. And then just thinking about something that I saw with Henry Louis Gates last week, he was talking about the actual numbers of Africans who ended up in the area called the United States during the enslavement process. And it was somewhere around 300,000, whereas the majority of those who were captured were taken to places like Brazil and to the Caribbean. So when you look at the population of people who may be related to formerly enslaved Africans, it happened as a result of, I can't think of another way to put this except to say breeding, and,
yes.
And when you look at what happened with Sally and Mary and how many offspring were generated as a result of that, and you see that process being duplicated by many others who were involved in that process. Yes, there are some of us who are directly related to those, and then there are some of us who are related to people who are already here. Just curious about your take on the idea of being indigenous versus being a descendant of someone who was formerly enslaved. How important do you think that is, and what are your thoughts about that phenomenon?
Well, I think you've really hit on something there with that question, and that is what usually happens in history or in teaching history or whatever is there comes a generalization so that everyone is all tamped into one basket, or so that if you talk about slavery, it's all the same. And while they may have commonalities, it wasn't all the same. There were different levels, there were different, one thing and the other. And so what we have then well, even the development of people of color have had so many different paths and channels, and that it's hard to generalize. And I know you have to do it somewhat in order to get the story told. But what you've just mentioned here is, for instance, in Ohio, since that's where we live and that's what we know, Ohio, in terms of people of color, had three different ways that people of color got here. The first one was that there are people who were never slaves. There were black people who were never slaves. They were born free, or very early on. A lot of folks don't know that. Well, we know very early when Ohio became available to people, many of those people that were of African descent but were free, made the decisions they were going to go north, because the Ohio Territory at that time seemed to be a safer place for them to be. The second group of people we know that entered into Ohio were runaway slaves, especially from Kentucky, the border states, Kentucky, from Maryland, from Virginia, obviously, but also as far away as North Carolina. And there were numbers of those that made that trip. And then there were those who had recently been freed one way or the other. Sometimes they bought their own freedom. Sometimes they were freed by the will of an individual that had been an enslaver and had passed away and decided to free his or her slaves. And there was that group of people that came. And all of them then had different backgrounds, different experiences. So the development of their situation, shall we say, was different. They were all black or African American or whatever you want to call us, people of color, but they still had a different, for instance, a person that had been a runaway slave. His development was different from a person that had been always free. He always for a long time, went around looking over his shoulder for fear that he would be captured and taken, which did happen, and taken back into enslaved territory. Or those who came later on, that was not like they were free, but they wasn't free like the first group. Difficulty tended to be more economical, shall we say, because they had gone from situations, because they had been slaves in many cases, but they went from situations of where they were, and I don't know how to put this without making it sound different than what I'm trying to convey here, given what they needed for life. For instance, they were given a portion of food, a portion of clothing, a portion, that kind of thing. But also along with that, they were told what to do. And so these people then had to, what I call, learn to live as free people. They had to learn to know how to get what they needed for life. They had to do a lot of things that they had never been called upon to do or didn't have the background to do. And then there was the group that came very early that were people of color that were always free. These people tended to be, by our standards, rather well off, shall we say, that for some reason or other they had owned land in the South. They sold the land. They had money. When they came to Ohio, they had an economic status that they were able to do things like, I told you, the Barnett family purchased bukus of land and that kind of thing. And so all three of those groups then were sort of in, like they were here in Chillicothe or in the Ross County area. And even though they were all people of color, they developed in different ways. And this has been, this has changed the culture then of that group, of that particular group. And so when you start talking about culture of black people or people of color, and that when sometimes people say that we don't have any culture, we do have. But it's different because of depending on the group from which we evolved. And that probably doesn't answer your question, but that's what I think this is in line with what you're asking me.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to something that we talked about the other day, because, just based on things that have been shared with me, I've just had this idea that there was a certain lack of cultural awareness, but I think it depends on what aspect of culture you're talking about. There are folks who have an awareness of what Kwanzaa is, and Kwanzaa directly relates to our African ancestry, but everyone doesn't necessarily relate to African ancestry. They relate to the ancestry that they know of. So if they don't know of that aspect of African ancestry, then they have no reason, so it's not really fair for anyone to look at them a certain kind of way because they ain't down with the Afrocentricity, but on the other hand, go ahead.
I was going to say that brings up one other thing that I've thought of, and you're exactly right with what you're saying. But, even with all of that, there are certain aspects of the African American development that we, even though we may not have a direct line back with what happened in Africa, there are certain things that have kind of come down to us that we do. One of the things that comes to mind is the idea of the name. In Africa, how important the naming process is. And that how a lot of times they were given two names, one being a hidden name, and they would go by the nickname, we would call that, okay? When you look at, and this is changing some in the modern days, but through our history, one of the things you will find in the African American community is the nickname. And this tends to be a fallout from the of what happened in Africa and how important the name was. And that it was even sometimes secret, and where it would be whispered and not even said aloud, so that the bad spirits couldn't learn the name. And of course, that's not what's going on in the development of the African American. But the idea of the nickname tends to go back to that old Africanism that has to do with the importance of one's name. There are a few other things like that too. Some of them are inculcated in our religious practices. That we do, and now your family's, I think, Baptist. I know Miss Annie is.
Yes.
Maybe okay. And I've been Baptist forever and a day, and so there are certain things that we do in the Baptist church or have done over there, the Baptist, and even in some of the Methodist churches. Certainly in the Pentecostal and other churches, there are certain things we do that we take for granted. To give you just a quick example. There, in the music of the Black church, historically there has always been a let's see. We used to progress into the sanctuary. We don't do it so much now because we then got a whole lot of different instruments, and we're different than we used to be.
Right.
But back in the day, as they say, there was always a progression into the service. And it was done by music, but it was also the entrance into the sanctuary was done in a particular rhythmic way. And did you ever think about that? About where that came from?
Yeah.
And why? Mm-hmm. That okay. Here's the other thing. In the Baptist church, you would hear it would be full of amens and the say it, brother, or whatever. Mm-hmm. We called that sanctioning. You're sort of cheerleading the pastor on. Mm-hmm. That is, when you study our history, and going back to Africa, that is a direct representation of what used to happen in what they called the something called the something dance, and I can't think of the name of it. In other words, they would get together in a ring dance. They would be in a circle, and it was in a religious, and when whoever the griot was for the particular tribe or group would speak information or speak truth, that would be received by saying something that agreed with what the man was saying. And this is a direct, and when you look at how we used to do church, it's a direct throwback to the old African tradition of accepting leadership, shall we say. And there's more, but there are two things that I can think of that even people who don't have a, shall we say, a direct conduit back to Africanisms still do, because this has been passed down in their families.
Okay. I want you to hold that thought. We're going to come back to it because I have something I want to share with you regarding that and growing up in the Baptist church. This is Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guest is Beverly J. Gray. She's a historian and educator, and she's very well versed. I have to hand it to you. You're just blowing my mind with what you're giving us today. We're going to be right back after this.
Hi, this is Gerard Amir Shakir, and you're listening to 95.9 FM. Our Voices United, Burton Bell Carr Community Radio.
Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson. Again, fascinating conversation with educator and historian Beverly Gray. I was just reflecting on growing up in the Baptist church, and I can remember times when we were in Southern Ohio, perhaps times when we were down south in Savannah, Georgia, but you would come into the church and, like you said, there was this kind of processional situation, but the deacons would be on the front row and you would hear them going, they were just moaning, and you didn't know what they were saying, but it was just something that just kind of reverberated through your body. So,
and that's paramount. That's paramount to the chant that our African ancestors would do. That was that moan thing you talked about is a direct representation of that. Yes. Africanism of the ring in the ring thingy. They would moan, and that was it was a chant that they did, and
yes. So that. So you've got that, you've got the call and response, you've got a lot of things, just the whole idea of stomping your feet and clapping your hands. Well, they wouldn't let us have drums. They wouldn't let us have instruments, but we were in the mindset and the spirit of making a joyful noise. So we used what we had, and it was hands and feet. And then eventually you got your tambourines, and it's also interesting just reflecting on how different we are and diverse we are in our religious practices. There would be one church where, you were too dignified to do that, and then you go to other churches and people are getting the Holy Ghost and they're all out in the aisles and, all of that. And I think all of that has a direct relationship to who we are. And the whole point of making that connection, when I talked about the bridge, is just for us to realize that no matter where we are on the planet, we're still the same people. I've been to Africa a few times, and I've seen people from many different, I call them nations versus tribes, but I see people from many different nations. And when I look around here in Ohio and other parts of the country, I see the same physical characteristics. We are 26 different shades, so we're not light skinned necessarily because there was miscegenation. It just happens that, some of us are light, some of us are dark. So you don't have to have a white person in order to be a light skinned person. I think we really need to know that. There's so much about history, so much about biology that we're not aware of. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention quickly before we move forward was just the whole idea that you talked about in terms of the name, because some of us have created names, not knowing if they had meaning or not, but just having this idea that somehow this represents who I am. So I might name my child LaQuisha or something like that. Again, don't know what it means. It may not have a meaning at all, but when you look at the African tradition and the intentionality of the name, I'm familiar with the day naming process. So having been to Ghana several times and having a relationship with people that are there, I received a name, and it was easy. I was born on a Thursday, so my name is Yao. There's no confusion about that. And everybody in those communities, they all have a name based on the day that they were born. But then there's a thing that happens where they observe a child. They don't give the child that name right away, but they observe a child and they may see something in that child that reminds them of one of their ancestors. So, for instance, the name Babatunde. Babatunde means father who has returned. So there's a direct relationship to someone who existed before, and I think it's just in us to naturally want to do that. We've been on for 3 segments, and I've looked at your resume, and I'm just blown away by all the things that you've done. You've been involved in Oprah Winfrey Productions, producing a program that aired on the Hemings descendants in Southern Ohio. You were involved in a PBS documentary called A View from the Mountain back in 1992. There is an A&E biography series, Sammy Hemings, Redefining History, that you were involved in. Frontline, the Ohio Humanities Council exhibit, The Underground Railroad. I mean, there's just so many things that you've been able to do, in addition to having taught in the schools the way that you have. So it's really rewarding for me to see the trajectory that has happened over a period of time, and to know that you are still connected. You're still doing things in terms of tutoring and reaching out to young folk. What is it that you think that has motivated you to be so, and I know you talked about your relationship to history, but so motivated to stay engaged in the process of education?
Okay. I really never knew when I started with this, it was, and still is in one sense, it was a hobby, something I was just really interested in doing. And then as life's bumps came along, I found that the more I was able to immerse myself in solving mysteries and this kind of stuff, it helped me deal with whatever it was I had to deal with in life. It allowed me to rest my mind from whatever was going on at the present, to solve some sort of mystery or find some information and that kind of thing. But I always enjoyed it so much. I just really had it. It was just so satisfying finding information. And so I was always one of those people that I never wanted anything to get in the way of my Christian walk. Sometimes, we get so involved in what we're doing because we enjoy it that it gets in the way of what God would have us to do. And so every time, though, that I tried to pull back and sort of tone down what I was doing in terms of doing historical research and one thing and the other, there was always something that would happen that would make me see that this was a positive thing. I remember one time when I decided I was going to quit this, I wasn't going to do any more research. I was done. It was just getting to be too much. And I got this call from this lady that I had researched, or I had interviewed, maybe 2 years before. And we found out that she had a close relationship to someone who lived here in Chillicothe, and they had not seen each other in years and years and years. But because of the information that I had found and that kind of thing, they were able to come back together. They had lived in Boston, as a matter of fact. They came back to Chillicothe. They knew that their ancestors were from here, and the two sides were able to meet again and come back together. And when I saw, they had a little gathering in the park, a little picnic in the park, and when I saw those two people and what it meant to them and how it had blessed them, I realized that maybe this was something God wanted me to do. The other part of that, Vince, is I am truly convinced that God wants us to know what our past was. It's been hidden from us. It's been changed. Lies have been told. Every way that you could crush down, and it was used to crush us down as a people. One of the ways I got involved in all this is when my daughter was in the 3rd grade, and her teacher told her the class was doing a family chart, and she told her that Alicia that she couldn't do her chart because she had slaves in the family and she didn't have any history. And when I realized that about how they had tried to shut us down, even from the time we're 8 years old onward, even in the modern day, it made me realize that I really believe God wants us to know who we are, what we've been through. He wants it to come out publicly. And if you kind of think about it, a little at a time is beginning to dribble out, in spite of what's going on the national stage of trying to kill our history and all of that. If you go back, for instance, I think it was last summer when they had the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. Most people said, "What? I never heard tell of. Well, I never heard tell of that." I mean, this is black and white people would say that. And so, in our little Facebook presentation that we have done, that we would get online and have forums, we decided that we could maybe educate a little bit. And so we went through the history, went through the records, and we came up with 10 other massacres that had taken place in the United States, one of them being Rosewood in Florida, which is one of the most gross ones. And there's been a documentary made and all of that kind of stuff. And we had a round table, and several people in the community took one of the massacres and talked about it. And so we were able to get out there that not only Tulsa happened, but there were these other massacres that took place. And then we were able to bring it on home, because we know that in Ross and Pike and Scioto County, this kind of thing happened, where from Portsmouth, Ohio, all in 1830, all of the blacks were literally run out of Portsmouth, and they settled north of Portsmouth in a little place called Houston Hollow. But, I mean, they had to flee their homes and leave. Same thing happened in Pike County, Ohio, in Waverly, which became a sundown town and clear up into modern era, where at least two or three of the people that lived there and owned property were literally driven out at night, kind of in the way that the Ku Klux Klan used to operate, by just making people pick up and leave. And the same thing happened in Cincinnati. So these kinds of issues happen throughout our history. People didn't know about that. And so one of the things we have been trying to do then is to let people know what has happened and that these things are true. When I saw that thing on Tulsa, that's just so mind-blowing. And I know that they are trying to rebuild that now. There's a documentary going on OWN now about how they're trying to rebuild what they used to call the Black Wall Street. But when you think, and see what I hope this does for young people, when you see what we've been through, but we've been able to keep going, that young people should be able to hopefully will catch that same spirit, that whatever they're going through, and it's you know what, it's hard for young people today, I believe. And so it's because of that, I guess, that I do what I do, and I did what I did because, as I said, I really believe this is our time, that God wants us to know these things so that we can progress, and that our young people will have a foundation on which to thrive.
Well, I want to co-sign what you said, because you said there were times when you thought about ceasing and desisting, but something in you kept pushing you to do that. And I firmly believe that your purpose is to do exactly what you are doing. And God was speaking to you to enable you to live within your purpose. And in terms of young people today, I know I'm up there in age, not quite where you are, but I'm on this thing called social media. And I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and, you know, a lot of the things that come across my feed are things of a historical nature. And the reason that I'm receiving those things is because of the way that algorithms work. So now I'm hearing these stories, like the story of the guy who put himself in a box and shipped himself to freedom. You know, yep. There are so many stories of how we got over, how we were able to claim some type of victory. But the issue is that for whatever reason, the powers that be, the folks who are controlling things, want us to be stuck in this state of perpetual victimhood and not see ourselves as the great and mighty people that we are. And I think when we wake up to the reality of who we are, and also embrace the idea that we have been given gifts by God to exercise and use, just as you are living in your purpose, that we really can make a difference in the lives of people. Ms. Gray, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today. I've learned so much about you, and I've learned so much about history as a result of this 57-minute conversation that we've had. I think somehow we need to do this again because there's so much that went uncovered in our conversation today. But I thank you. I respect your knowledge, and thanks for being my guest on Open Door.
Thank you, Vince.
All right. And to those of you who are listening, I hope you have gotten the benefit as well. As always, know yourself. Love yourself, be yourself, make today your absolute best day. Peace.